So we're sitting here in Irvington, Virginia, and these are basically all of the major steamboat wharfs in the Chesapeake Bay.
I remember going out there with my father and, and standing on the dock and the pier watching it come in.
I don't know what the people would have done, I'll be honest with you, because they couldn't get anything, they couldn't go nowhere.
It was the first stop out of Baltimore of the Pianka tank, and of course the last one going back.
And there were times when these boats, depending on the time of the year, that these boats carried so much in the way of produce that they had the baskets stacked all the way to the overhead.
At the dawn of the 19th century, much of the Chesapeake Bay region was completely isolated. There were no bridges over the region's rivers, and roads were little more than muddy trails. Sailing ships moved cargo from ports like Baltimore and Norfolk, but travel was slow and dependent on the weather. But on June 13, 1813, a steamboat, the Chesapeake, left Baltimore for Annapolis, and the steamboat era on Chesapeake Bay had begun. The bay's second steamer, the Eagle, was the first to travel between Baltimore and Norfolk, and suddenly people in isolated communities in Maryland and Virginia could move easily and economically from one place to another. Even more important, these watercraft were large enough to accommodate both passengers and cargo, so farmers and watermen in rural areas were able to ship their products to market without delay. The boats were also a means of shipping manufactured goods, such as tools, building materials, fertilizer, and clothing, from the city to the rural areas. But the boats also had a huge social impact. Passengers in rural, isolated areas of the bay used the boats to shop in the city, go to medical appointments, visit friends and relatives, or take in theater or other entertainment. Residents of Baltimore boarded boats to explore small fishing villages on both sides of the bay. A ride on the steamboat was an event.
Let's go back in time and climb aboard a steamboat and take that steamboat all around the Chesapeake Bay. We'll embark from Baltimore, wave goodbye to the folks on shore, then watch that light street wharf just fade away. From a stateroom on the upper deck of the steamboat, we'll watch the sights and spend our nights in reverie. Then we'll awaken with the dawn, put our very finest on, and as we pull into each port of call, we'll greet everybody with a "Hi, you all," then get back steaming round the Chesapeake Bay.
Jack Shawm is perhaps the leading authority on Chesapeake Bay steamboats, having written 3 books about their history. At the age of 8, Jack took his first voyage, likely igniting what would become a lifetime passion.
Because it was a marvelous experience, it really was, and it began down on the Baltimore waterfront, Pier 3 Pratt Street, which is where the National Aquarium is now today. And you walked in, went up to the second floor, and there was a big waiting room and a ticket office. And you went over to the ticket office. My stepfather went over and he paid his money, and they gave him a ticket. And we then went to a long gangway that went down onto the foredeck of the ship. And once you were on board the ship, you went into the interior there, and it was like going back into the 19th century, because all of this fabulous woodwork that was around the ship and indirect lighting through the stained glass domes that they had on the boat and the clear story windows and whatnot, and we were just drinking this all in, the wrought iron railings, the stairways with brass facing on them, and so you went down halfway down the corridor and you stopped at the purser's office, and the purser would take your ticket and he'd give you some information about your stateroom, and then he'd give you this big brass key with a tag on the back of it that had the ship's name on it and the stateroom number, and this thing was enormous. I bet it was like that, and you used that in these brass locks, and it took into these staterooms. It could be anything from upper and lower berths to double beds and baths and what have you. So you got yourself settled, and then 6:30 in the evening, the whistle blows, the ship starts to back out of the pier, and you're sort of sitting on the deck, and you can feel the rumble of the engines. And she turns around in the inner harbor and heads down the bay, and that's when the fun really began. Passing by the lighthouses, passing by the buoys in the bay and other ships and so forth and so on. And by the time you got down around Annapolis, it was dinner time. And you went to the dining room, which was located on the forward, all the way forward on the ship, right under the wheelhouse. It was a great vantage point to see what was going on around you on the water and on the land. And the cuisine was to die for. It really was fantastic cuisine. In fact, the cuisine on these boats was known far and wide, and people would take these trips and specify, I want to be on such and such a boat, on such and such a line, because I've heard that the food is so fantastic. And if you look at one of the menus from back in those days, they are every bit as extensive as what you would have found on a transatlantic ocean liner. So you spent the evening in the dining room really living it up, and then afterwards it's dark by that time, and you could roam the deck and watch the stars and watch the lighthouses go by and so forth and so on. And then when it finally came time for bed, a little kid doesn't want to go to bed. He wants to stay up and have fun. And so we managed to stretch it a little bit, but finally you had to go to bed. And when you go to bed, it was really nice because the rooms weren't very large, but you had a window. Each room had a window, not a porthole. And you could open the window, slide it to one side, and then it had a louvered shutter that went up and down. And turn your light out, climb into the bed, lower your shutter, and you could hear the wash of the ship going through the water. You hear the bells on some of the buoys that were close by. And there was something about climbing into that bunk. The sheets were fresh and smelled great and were nice and crisp and so forth. And the movement of the boat, just a little bit of movement, not much at all. They rocked a little bit, and then they had this reassuring creaking because they were wooden superstructures, and the whole thing just saw fit to put you to sleep. And the morning began with a knock on the door from the steward was coming around. He says, Old Point Comfort, 5:30, time to get moving. And so you got up at Old Point Comfort and came in just about as the sun was coming up, and they tied up at Old Point, unloaded a few passengers, unloaded some cargo, and then the rest of the trip was about an hour and a half across Hampton Roads into Norfolk. And when you got into Norfolk, you went past the naval base. You got to see all these fantastic naval ships, and we ended the trip by having breakfast in the dining room, which was everything a Southern breakfast should be. And we picked the car up off the car deck and headed off for Virginia Beach.
While Jack's introduction to steamboats came near the end of their run, these boats quickly changed the face of the Chesapeake Bay region by the middle of the 1800s. And over a century and a half, the boats evolved.
When they were first run on, when the steamboat first came on the Chesapeake Bay, they were all side wheelers. They burned wood logs going down the bay. They didn't carry very much cargo at that point. They were basically providing transportation for people, and every available square foot on the boat was given over to storing the pine logs that they needed to put in the furnaces to fire the boilers. And that went on for a long, long time. And in the early days, the boats were completely built of wood. Their hulls, their superstructures, and so forth. And some of them actually carried auxiliary sails in the early days for if they got delayed along the way because of storms or ice or whatever, or if they ran out of fuel, ran out of logs, they could put the sails up and get them to port. Didn't happen often, but it did happen every once in a while. And then eventually, the construction of the ships changed, and you were getting iron hulls with still wooden superstructures, still side wheelers. It wasn't until 1887 that the Old Bay Line had its first propeller-driven steamer, ship named the Georgia, single screw, one propeller, and they could, again, they were able to do about 16, 17 miles an hour. And at this time, you're also seeing the fitting out of the ships becoming a lot more sophisticated, more ornate interiors, and that sort of thing. The engines were reciprocating engines, which are the kind with the pistons that would go up and down like this. They thought about putting turbines into the boats in the early 20th century, but decided against that, thinking that if you transferred an engineering crew from one boat to the other, they'd have to get used to the other type of equipment, and so they just kept it that way. When they no longer used wood for fuel, they used coal, and then it went to oil, and late part of the 1920s, the boats transferred over to oil. Some of them stayed coal until the end.
As the industry developed, other steamboat lines came into existence, each serving different regions of the bay. The trip from Baltimore to Norfolk was on the Old Bay Line. There's an interesting story about how that line influenced the name of a product that is likely on the shelf of every kitchen in the Chesapeake Bay region.
There was a German immigrant who came to Baltimore in the early part of the 20th century, and he was either in the spice business or he decided to found the spice business when he got here. So he set up a shop in a very small, nondescript building on Light Street, which is where all the steamboat wharves were located. And he flourished for a while, and then his business got bigger, and he decided he needed a slightly larger building. So he got another building down there on Light Street, figuring this was a good place to be because there was so much commerce going on in that area. Well, after a while, he said, we're going to grow again, and we want to introduce a new product, but what should I call it? And he was sitting there one day looking out his window, and he said, Old Bay. Old Bay. That's what we'll call it. And to this day, Old Bay is named for the Old Bay Line Steamship Company. And once years ago, we were in a supermarket, and they actually had a sign up in the seafood department that said, do you know where the name Old Bay came from? It came from a steamship line.
The Civil War, beginning in 1861, threatened to upset the steamboat industry on the Bay, since Maryland was part of the Union and Virginia part of the Confederacy. But for the most part, it was a minor blip, as the U.S. Navy ensured the boat's safety, and the boats served the Union cause.
The steamers actually, for the most part, continued to run as normal on the bay because the bay did stay in Union hands all through the Civil War. In the case of the Baltimore to Norfolk steamers, they weren't able to continue on to Norfolk. They ended their voyage down at Old Point Comfort. Sometimes, depending on who the passenger was, they could get special dispensation through the military authorities to go across Hampton Roads by a connecting steamer in order to get into Confederate-held territory. Several of the boats were requisitioned by the federal government to run between City Point on the James River and Baltimore or Washington. They were used for as mail boats, as carrying troops. There were several of them that went down to Cape Hatteras during the Burnside expedition in 1862 to try to take the Carolina Sounds, and carried not only troops, but they carried horses for the use of the mounted cavalry and so forth and so on. But none of them really left the area like they did in other wars. They stayed pretty much in the Chesapeake area. They weren't converted in any way. They just took the boat over. They used its cargo space for the troops and the equipment and whatnot. The staterooms were used to accommodate soldiers and the like, but they pretty much continued as normal, but it did take the business did take a hit because a lot of the southern businesses that they relied on were pretty hard hit during the war, and it took them a long time to rebuild afterwards.
After the war, their steamboats helped rural Virginia get back on its feet. More wharves were built, allowing farmers to resume sales of their agricultural products to urban ports, adding to the prosperity of coastal areas. After the end of the Civil War and a brief period of Reconstruction, Black Americans faced harsh discrimination from Jim Crow laws in the South that severely limited their freedom and opportunities. But in spite of the discrimination that prevailed throughout much of the steamboat era on the Chesapeake, the story of one man stands out. Captain Hansford C. Bayton, born in 1863 in Essex County, Virginia, overcame all obstacles to operate a steamboat line on the Rappahannock in the late 19th century.
And Captain Bayton was actually brought up not on the water, but on the farm. And he, in his early life, developed a love for the water, and ended up owning his own steamboat company, primarily bringing mail back and forth on the Rappahannock River.
Captain Bayton secured a federal contract to carry the mail, serving a number of northern neck communities, including Irvington.
He, believe he's ended up operating, it was multiple steamboats, if I remember correctly, bringing mail and passengers and probably freights as well, back and forth, which was very important for this region. Getting the mail, it might sound simple to us, but the importance of getting the mail on time, getting not just correspondence from your loved ones, but also important federal and state papers as well. I mean, everything had to come by steamboat, and so he was part of that sort of integral waterborne network of mail service.
Starting with one boat, Captain Bayton added another. His 39-foot steamer, the Owen Dillard, is shown here at a wharf.
But he basically persevered for several decades in this capacity as a steamboat captain. His personality was definitely one of making it work. It's against, it's all odds. It's against the tide, basically, as the title says. And like you said, he definitely was a savvy business person.
And with it came success. In 1895, Captain Bayton was elected to the Rappahannock Town Council, perhaps drawing the ire of many firmly entrenched segregationists of the era.
As the Jim Crow laws were intensifying, and as persecution sort of was ramping up for local African Americans, basically there were a couple fires that burned his steamboats, and it's not entirely clear what caused those fires, because at least one of the ships didn't even have steam up, meaning that their boilers were cold, so it's unclear what the fire source would actually be. Really, it's an accident is sort of ruled out as probably arson, most likely, and possibly targeted towards him because he was an African American businessman. But really, we'll never know because there's just no proof it's either way.
Hansford Bayton lived a full and meaningful life, dying in 1927 from the effects of a stroke. He was carried to his final resting place, how else, on a steamboat on the Rappahannock River. Steamboats not only changed the culture of remote regions of Chesapeake Bay, they also created communities where there was only forest land and shoreline. A good example is Mila in eastern Northumberland County, Virginia, on Penny Creek. In the late 19th century, William Lewis Russell purchased 110 acres from Sam Harcum and began an enterprise that led to a community.
What was the small store and what was added onto it, because there's a line, right between where the old store was, and then the much larger store was added on. And so Grandpa bought the small store and 110 acres, I think it was, from Sam Harcum, and negotiated the contract and built the dock and the warehouse and a tomato factory and a crab house and an oyster house, and it was quite a enterprise going. It was the first stop out of Baltimore of the Pianka tank, and of course the last one going back.
Russell's enterprise provided jobs for people who lived nearby. They might work in the general store, or in the crab house, or in one of the canning factories, creating what was, in fact, a company town.
Lots of stuff. I mean, there was a whole token economy there, which it amazes me, because there were all these people working on the farm, because it was a 100-acre farm, and then there were people working in the crab house and the oyster house and the tomato factory and in the store. And so they would import stuff from Baltimore, and they would give tokens.
And when you say token economy, what do you mean by that?
People would work there, and in exchange they would get tokens, coins, that they exchanged at the store for what they needed. Food, cloth, whatever they needed, general merchandise.
So Mila had its own currency.
Exactly.
And because Mila was the last stop of the Pianka tank on its return to Baltimore, and the first stop when the steamboat came back to the Northern Neck, the steamboat was an important transportation resource.
Well, it was the only transportation.
Yeah, there's no railroads.
There were no railroads in the Northern Neck, and no real road traffic at that point in time. I mean, we're talking 1894 to 19. Let's see. Well, I think it operated until the 30s. The steamboat coming in. It was the hub of everything that went on until at least the mid-19-teens. You know, it certainly was when my father was young, because he remembered all of that.
Mila remains a community today, though the steamboat wharf is long gone, the victim of a major hurricane and the Great Depression.
Yeah, the family was quite well off till the Depression.
Yeah, a lot of people on that boat. Yeah.
Yeah. But at least he had the farm, and it was a working farm, and he had the seafood business, and it was a going concern for the seafood business. So our family actually, I mean, didn't end up rich, but was able to get through pretty well through the Depression anyway.
Yeah.
After stopping in Mila, the Pianka tank line stopped at numerous Northern Neck wharves as it made its way down the bay. The Kilmarnock Wharf was on Indian Creek at the end of Waverly Avenue, the present site of Chesapeake Boat Basin, and it was a regular stop beginning around 1890.
Well, they had at least two places that I know of, perhaps three on Indian Creek. Of course, the first one that we think about is the one at Kilmarnock Wharf, where there's a marina there now. But the second one was just down the creek just a wee bit, and about a couple hundred yards from where I live. It was an old storehouse that stayed there for years, and it was called Birdton Wharf, Byrdton, I guess named after Admiral Byrd, as their post office was. And that was the place to be. You know, they had canned tomatoes, there was oyster shuckers, and it was kind of a place to be where everybody gathered to chit-chat and whatever else that happened in those days. So, and we also think there may be one on the other side of Indian Creek, but have not been able to prove it. The only thing they found there was some pilings, but there used to be a pulpwood yard there where they brought pulpwood in, and they took it out by tugs and barges. And that could have been what that was. Also, that could have been at the same place that the steamboat dock was over there. So we know of two and perhaps three on Indian Creek, which is very close to where I live.
At the Kilmarnock Wharf, there was also a Menhaden factory. The smokestacks can be seen in the background. When a steamboat approached a rural wharf, it was a source of excitement. In the early 2000s, the Steamboat Era Museum conducted a series of oral histories from people who remembered those days.
Fields or something for years. We could see that steamboat go up the river, see it when you come down. We could see it when you get down when you come down the road, we could meet that steamboat. We could get that at Potomac Wharf before the steamboat got there, because they had, when they come down the road, we just go by a banner over there, and we could beat them down there if we can, asparagus and strawberries and whatnot like that. Yeah.
We would go down on the boat with my brothers who had the whatever they're going to put on the steamer. And we would say, I said, oh, here come the boat, here come the boat. But he didn't say anything. And because you could see it in view, some kind of a whistle that would blow. It sounded more like a horn, I think.
Long before they got here, certainly a mile or two, a mile anyway. So you'd have time to get to the wharf by the time they got there. But you could hear that whistle all over, just echoed, you know, loud whistle. They had rather distinctive whistles. As you could tell by the whistle which boat it was. You could tell the Potomac's whistle, because it was different than the Anne Arundel. You could tell the difference. They were all steam whistles. And they were about this long, three-sided things, brass. And in the pilot house, you had a string with a knot on the end, good big knot on the end. You just pull it on. They'd let you do it. They'd let children do it every now and then.
And then it would, we would know then that it's just about ready to land. And then you see them getting ready, everybody getting ready, and when it does come up near to land, people on the boat, you see them throwing out lines and different things, and maybe an anchor or something to slow the boat so that it will come right in place where they want it to be.
Sometimes the captain would back and fill a little bit after it was tied to pull her in, make her come in closer.
One of the longest steamboat routes ran from between Baltimore and Washington and took 36 hours because it stopped at 25 landings along the way on both shores of the Potomac. The first stops in Virginia were at wharves in the Cone River. The first stop was at Cone Wharf, across the river from Bundick. Most of the buildings survived long after the steamboats stopped running. Remnants of the wharf could still be seen in 1982 when artist Bill Martz made this drawing. The wharf at Bundick was operated by a Mr. Thomas, whose house can be seen on the right. The buildings fell into decay after steamer service stopped in 1937. The site became a shipping point for grain and soybeans. The community of Lake, at the end of Lake Road, was the third steamboat wharf on the river, built in 1909. At least 2 canneries were built near the wharf, and they survived even after the end of steamboat service. Walnut Point, near the mouth of the Cone, owed much of its existence to the steamboats. Near the landing, there was a general store along with tomato and herring packing plants. Cowart's Wharf, located at the end of a glebe, was also near the mouth of the Cone River and served families on the west side of the river. In the early 2000s, the Steamboat Era Museum interviewed John Cowart about the origins of Cowart's Wharf.
My father bought it. It was just a house, which he reworked to some extent. It's been reworked 2 or 3 times since then. And then when he got the 1908, if he got the steamboat wharf, he built a wharf. And then eventually he built a country store where the post office was involved, and then the steamboat wharf eventually had a cover over it, from one end to the other, which is a little bit unusual. Not many places had a cover. And on the end of it, on the shore end, he had a warehouse where people could deliver things and pick up things.
Louisetta, also on the west side of the river, was the last stop for steamers on the Cone that then returned to the Potomac and headed west toward Washington. All 6 wharves served the Northumberland communities of Lottsburg and Calliope, giving residents easy access to the outside world. Inside the Yokomoco River, on the Potomac southern shore, there were at least 3 wharves that provided stops for steamboats bound for Washington. Lodge Landing had a sizable wharf that mostly shipped agricultural products. Monday Point, at the west end of the mouth of the river, also had a wharf. But the principal Yokomico wharf was at the village of Kinsale. The port provided deep water and a population served by a general store and who would sometimes travel to Washington or Baltimore. And because the steamers provided an economical way to move agricultural products to market, Kinsale was another of the wharfs that had tomato canning factories nearby. As of 1915, there were 3 canneries in the vicinity of the village. The freight carried by the steamboats included every item sold in stores or used in the homes or on farms. Area farmers not only transported their crops to market, but also sheep, cows, and chickens. Part of the crew of each steamer was a gang of about 12 deckhands who handled the lines and loaded and unloaded the freight. The young men were typically strong and able to pick up sheep and carry them on board with little effort. It's no surprise that because of the region's dependence on steamboats, young men would be attracted to the industry. Captain Robert Duncan Bailey, who was born near Kinsale, was very typical of 19th century steamboat captains on the Chesapeake. While his boats did not serve Kinsale, he had many of the qualities that made for successful captains.
Well, of course, the captain that stood out to me was Captain Samuel Boyd Chapman, skipper of the City of Richmond, who started working on that boat when she was new in 1913, spent almost his entire career until 1962 on that steamer. He was our master from 1936 to 1962. Just a gentleman, a total gentleman. He hailed from Matthews County, Virginia, which they used to say was a veritable breeding ground for Chesapeake Bay steamboatmen. And he loved working with people and taking people. He took people on tours of the boat, took people to the engine room, up to the wheelhouse. If you were fortunate enough to be seated at his table in the dining room, you had yourself a really special evening. His executive officer, Captain William S. Walker, who was from Gloucester County, Virginia, I think it was. Same way, perfect gentleman.
Today, Kinsale remains a port village with its history preserved at the Kinsale Museum. Throughout the village, there are still reminders of a bygone era. Up the Potomac from the Yokomico River is Colonial Beach. Colonial Beach is another community that owes its existence to the steamboat. The town was platted in 1882 not as a sleepy fishing village, but as a purpose-built resort aimed squarely at Washingtonians with leisure time and a taste for breezy river travel. Entrepreneurs in the steamboat trade were central. They envisioned a beach, boardwalk, hotels, and a long pier that large sidewheelers could meet without navigating shallow water. In short, Colonial Beach was created to be reachable and irresistible by steamboat. An excursion culture boomed in the late 19th century. Potomac River lines added special weekend and holiday sailings. Washington's waterfront filled with wharves, feeding this new habit of summer escape. Colonial Beach quickly became one of the marquee destinations on those timetables. By the early 1900s, big excursion boats made Colonial Beach a near daily call in season. One of the best remembered was the St. John's, advertised by the Colonial Beach Company as the largest and handsomest excursion steamer on the Potomac, with a capacity of 2,500, a cafe, and live music for dancing on deck. Vintage postcards and advertisements show her lying alongside the town's pier, packed with day trippers, a vivid snapshot of peak steamboat tourism. Colonial Beach was also the site of the worst shipwreck on the Chesapeake and its tributaries. In August 1873, the Wawasset, a luxurious liner loaded with passengers from Washington, caught fire offshore from Colonial Beach. Horrified people on the shore watched in disbelief as the massive ship was quickly engulfed in flames. Today, the story of steamboats on the Chesapeake is told at the Steamboat Era Museum in Irvington, one of the only museums in the Chesapeake region to be entirely focused on that time. A lighted map in the museum provides visual context of the steamboat's impact on the region.
So we're sitting here in Irvington, Virginia, and these are basically all of the major steamboat wharfs in the Chesapeake Bay. And each one of these points here, the yellows and red points, these were the centers of community. These are the centers of transportation. This is basically where that you would be able to import manufactured goods. So if your local store needed something like nails or things like that, they could order them. And then of course you were exporting agricultural goods, cotton, grain, tobacco, even cattle actually. And this is also of course where that people would get their mail, send their mail out as well on the steamboats. So basically what's being highlighted here in the yellow dots, this is the 1921 schedule for the steamship Potomac, which is the pilot house that we have here. And basically the way that that the Potomac would run is it would start up in Baltimore, Maryland, and then come all the way down to the Rappahannock and hit all these points here, all these wharves, and then go on down to Norfolk and then repeat that process. And so, you'd have passengers and freight being loaded offloaded, and you can kind of envision really sort of like the wharf scene.
Some steamboats would travel all the way up the Rappahannock to Fredericksburg, stopping at other communities along the way to unload finished goods and then pick up livestock and agricultural products on the return trip. Milton Conrad is a lifelong waterman in Lancaster County who lives on Greenville Creek near the northern shore of the Rappahannock. He's collected memorabilia from the steamboat era and remembers stories from that time told by his father about how the steamboats changed the area's economy for the better.
Tomato factory was big in this area. It was right in this area from here down to the end of Bertrand. It was 5 tomato factories. And let me see, and has been high as 7 oyster houses in this area from 1880s to up till last. Now it's only one in the whole Lancaster County, and that's Kellum and Williams. And it was 100 and some one time.
Besides sending products to market, the steamboats also brought factory-produced goods from Baltimore to isolated rural areas.
And like I said, the closest steamboat dock is about a mile up the river here, and that's called Manaskin. And that's why back in those days, they didn't call them salesmen, they called them drummers. They'd come in on the steamboat and they'd go up to a fellow by the name of Sneed's farm there and rent a horse and buggy, and he'd go to the Lively and all down through Mellenback and Ottoman and all to sell his stuff, and they called them drummers in those days. And back in this creek, according to my daddy and his granddaddy, they had a pier head out the head of this creek. It was not a steamboat dock. And the schooners and the bug eyes would come in and tie up there to pick up produce for the farms and stuff. In the wintertime, they'd come and get lumber. And they had what they call a yawl boat.
Besides the economic impact in rural Lancaster County, the steamboats provided a major cultural advantage, offering the population mobility where none existed before.
I don't know what the people would have done, I'll be honest with you, because they couldn't get anything, they couldn't go nowhere, because the Rappahannock Bridge, that wasn't up until, I don't remember when that was built, but I remember the Whitestone Bridge, that was 1957. And nobody could get out of here. Otherwise, you was here and that was it.
By the early 20th century, improved roads provided increased mobility. A major storm effectively ended the steamboat era along the Rappahannock.
Until 1933, when they called it a nor'easter, but it was a hurricane, who washed just about all the docks away in 1933. So the last boat come up here, because my daddy was the Anna Rental, and that was about 1936. And that went to Manasquan, and they had partially fixed the dock so they could get out on it. And that was then trucks come about. A fellow by the name of Raymond Dobbins had the motor tractor there and an oyster house, and he had our truck run into North Carolina and all. So that just about ended the steamboat dock there.
Upriver from Manasquan is Moratica, a vibrant fishing village during the steamboat era. Its wharf served steamboats going upriver to Fredericksburg as well as on the return leg. In a 2009 oral history, Moratica native Cecil Brumley recalled watching the steamboats arrive as a child.
I can remember not too much. I was maybe 4, 5 years old, maybe, possibly. I remember going out there with my father and and standing on the dock and the pier, watching it come in and unload. And they didn't pick up anything freight to go back. They come back from after they've been up to Fredericksburg. Then they pick up the freight to carry to Baltimore all the way there. And other than that, and then the storm came.
The wharf was another victim of the 1930s hurricane and is long gone, but the memories are preserved at the Moratica Waterfront Museum. From Moratica, the steamboats would stop at the wharf in Sharps before it too disappeared. Communities along the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay were also served by steamers out of Baltimore. In the middle part of the bay, major stops included Crisfield, Tangier Island, and Onancock at the headwaters of Onancock Creek. Today, Onancock has preserved its steamboat history along what remains a busy waterfront, and like nearly every wharf, there was a general store. However, unlike most wharves, where the general store disappeared decades ago along with the wharf, Hopkins and Brother is not only still standing, but is still an important part of the community.
I just think that, there's a lot of people that have been interested in the preservation of this building, especially the Historical Society. It's just recently had a brand new roof put on it. So it's been a lot of restoration going into keeping this in the shape that it is in right now. It is currently, the Historical Society owns it, and we rent it out to Mallards, and so it's a booming little restaurant down here, and as you can see, it's sort of the hubbub of this part of the county.
The building is also something of a small museum, filled with reminders of the steamboat era, including displays, as well as the place where passengers paid for their tickets and booked passage on the steamboats. The Eastern Shore Steamboat Company had a virtual monopoly on the steamboat carrying trade between the Eastern Shore and Baltimore. At the foot of South Street, Baltimore, the boats headed south each day, stopping at several communities on the Eastern Shore. Onancock was served by the Eastern Shore Steamboat Line, which included boats from the Potomac and Rappahannock River lines. Boats heading south from Baltimore stopped at Onancock, as well as wharfs downriver on Tuesdays and Friday. Boats on the return trip stopped at Onancock on Mondays and Thursdays, providing an important transportation link.
Well, it connected Onancock and the Eastern Shore with mostly Baltimore, but it gave them a connection, a reliable way to get to the city. A lot of the farmers sold their produce and their oysters and their crabs, and it just gave them a way to do business off the Eastern Shore that wasn't here before. In the old days, of course, they used sail, but the steamboats were bigger and more reliable, and could stand rougher water. And so they gave these people here on the Eastern Shore a way to do business, mostly in Baltimore.
While seafood was a major local product, Onancock and the surrounding area was also known as a major sweet potato growing region, sending its products to market in Baltimore. Besides the general store, there were lots of warehouses where agricultural products were stored for shipment. But always, the Hopkins and Brother General Store played a key role.
And this was definitely the general store. And at one point, this store was not here. Actually, this store has been moved twice. And right around the corner goes into King Street. And so it was located back in the early 1800s, even before that. There was tons and tons of trade sheds, warehouses, that you can actually see a few that are left here, but all up the North Branch, which is right around that corner. There was lots of, it's deep, deep water over there, so there was lots and lots of trade going on. And I would imagine that is why Stephen Hopkins built this store there originally.
During the steamboat era, Onancock was served by the Crisfield steamers until 1932, and then the Baltimore, Crisfield, and Onancock line until 1939, remaining an important stop until the end.
It was a hub. I mean, this was actually a large hub of traffic, because you have to think about the ports that were in and out of. You have Cape Charles and you have the Onancock port, and then as you go up the coast, I mean, you hit Easton and you hit St. Michael's. You know, there's not a whole lot in between there. I mean, obviously there was Smith Island and Tangier and stuff, but there's always, especially the sweet potato trade, a lot of merchandise went out of here. A lot of crops were shipped out of here.
From the very start, steamboats competed with railroad lines. And while many factors led to the end of the steamboat era, the railroad certainly was a contributing factor, at least on the Eastern Shore.
Railroads, in many ways, they opened up destinations that the steamboats couldn't. I mean, you could get on the train out here and only and go to New York. And that was probably 6 or 8 hours away. And so it opened up a whole lot of other opportunities for people to travel and also do business. And the tracks ran right down the middle of the shore, so that the farmers that probably would have had difficulty bringing produce here in the days when the buckboard was a main way they transported them, they were able to send their crops up north at the various stops along the line.
Because rural area wharves were wrecked by storms and age in the 1930s and not replaced, steamboats on the Chesapeake became an endangered species. The main service was between Baltimore and Norfolk, lasting until 1962.
The freight was dying off a little bit because of the cost of handling freight and the fact that the boats were getting older and you were having trucks and other forms of transportation. So toward the end, the passenger business became almost seasonal, and they pretty much advertised it that way. They said, why should we keep a full run of stewards and cooks and so forth on board in the winter when we've only got a handful of passengers? And so they started for a while by limiting the number of passengers that they would take in the winter to, I think, 24 on the city of Richmond and 30 on the city of Norfolk, and that way you didn't have to have as many waiters and stewards and so forth. But then in 1961 they decided this just too costly, so they stopped passenger service completely in the winter of '61 with the plan to restore it in 1962, but then that's when they decided to shut down the operation.
After that, the bay was left to fishermen and cargo ships carrying goods to Baltimore from all over the world. And just like that, an era that transformed a region for nearly 150 years was over.
I really am concerned that the steamboat era is in danger of being forgotten. It's been 60 years, 62 years to be precise, since the last true steamboat operated on the Chesapeake Bay. And I don't see anything out there that would suggest that it's ever going to come back, but it's being forgotten for whatever reason, it's you look talk about steamboats to people, and sometimes they'll look at you blankly, like, "What are you talking about?" But yet, it was so doggone important to the development of the Tidewater region, and it's a chunk of history that, quite frankly, is being overlooked, and it shouldn't be.
But not completely forgotten. Though the steamboats are long gone, there is a physical reminder at the Steamboat Era Museum in Irvington, Virginia. The pilot house of the steamboat Potomac has been beautifully and carefully restored and is the centerpiece of the museum. But this gem could have easily been lost to history.
It was built in 1894 and sailed the Chesapeake Bay and the Rappahannock River, Potomac River. It's up until 1936, actually, which is a pretty long life for a steamboat. But the way that we got the pilot house is kind of a fascinating story. So we got it in the early 2000s, actually, but its history goes back to when it was first rammed in 1936. The steamship company didn't find it's economically viable to fix it, and so it was sold. The hull was sold to the West Point paper mill to be used as a pulpwood barge. The owners of the shipyard thought, man, this would make a really cool beach house, this pilot house here. And so what they did is they took off the pilot house and they brought it to Taft Beach in Whitestone.
And it sat there for decades, helping a family create memorable summers, but at the same time suffering the ravages of time and coastal weather.
Finally, it was taken off the beach and sent to a number of different museums hoping to restore it, but they were never quite able to make that step until it finally came to us in 2004, which we didn't actually restore it then either. We just kept it outside on the Irvington Town Commons for almost 2 decades, really. But finally, and right around 2018, the museum started its initiative to actually save the pilot house. And so during the course of about 3 years, the shipwright John Morgenthaler worked tirelessly to actually fully restore the interior and the exterior. And the difference is absolutely incredible. At first, the roof was caving in, everything was rotting away, and John was actually able to source brass parts for poles and knobs. He was able to make cherry beadboard for its interior to match. So he just did a really great job at creating a really authentic restoration of the pilot house.
Visitors to the museum can actually stand on the bridge, enjoying the vantage point of generations of steamboat captains. Up the Rappahannock River in Essex County lies another relic of the steamboat era, Saunders Wharf, built by farmer and merchant John Saunders. Teddy Bantz, part of the 7th generation to own the wharf, said the original wharf on the site was built in 1848.
This particular wharf was the last one built, and we think it was late 19th century, around 1900, maybe 1910.
Saunders Wharf is laid out like many of the wharves that dotted the region. There is a large warehouse area where goods could be unloaded and stored for shipment to local farmers and merchants. After the goods were distributed, the warehouse would be filled with produce to be picked up on the steamboat's return from Fredericksburg. The center part of the building contains a livestock pen, so that animals could be loaded aboard the boat and shipped to market in Baltimore. A waiting room along the east side of the building was the area where passengers would wait to board the boat. In its day, the wharf served Virginians from a wide area.
It would serve pretty much the upper Essex County and maybe some of Caroline County. I know that the Tollivers from Oklahoma, they used to they raised watermelons and cucumbers and made pickles, and they barrel the pickles and send them to Baltimore on the steamboat.
Most steamboat wharves extended far out into the river, but the very deep water allowed Saunders Wharf to be built on the shore, less exposed to storms. It may be one reason the wharf has survived all these years, but not the only reason.
Yes, it survived because my grandfather made sure that it always had a roof on it and always had pilings underneath of it. And he'd make his grandchildren in the summertime. We'd come down and we'd help put pilings under the wharf and put new tin on the roof. And that's the only way it has survived. Somebody cared about it.
The last steamboat visited Saunders Wharf in 1933, but the wharf, along with the Potomac pilot house, remains physical evidence of a bygone era that ended isolation and transformed the region.
Let's go back in time and climb aboard a steamboat and take that steamboat all around the Chesapeake Bay. We'll embark from Baltimore, wave goodbye to the folks on shore, then watch that light street wharf just fade away. From a stateroom on the upper deck of the steamboat, we'll watch the sights and spend our nights in reverie. Then we'll awaken with the dawn, put our very finest on, and as we pull into each port of call, we'll greet everybody with a "Hi, you all," and get back steaming round the Chesapeake Bay. The Norfolk Wharf aboard a steamboat. There's so much for us to see and do. We'll explore the Nanticoke, catch some crabs on the Potomac, and when we dock on the Isle of Tangier, you may hear a dialect of Shakespeare in Irvington. We'll watch a play aboard a showboat at a tent retreat in Weems. We'll spend a day, then on to the beaches and for a lark, we'll ride a Ferris wheel at an amusement park. Then back on board the ship we'll go with the oysters and tomatoes and the mail in tow. And we'll go steaming all of the way. Yeah, we'll go steaming round the Chesapeake Bay.